Hello, my name is Jonathan Hocker, and today we will be talking about data patterns and using data effectively. Today's presentation will cover the data being used, the value of the data, data patterns and data trends, data clustering and data associations, correlations, network analysis, optimization and risk reduction, trend analysis, and international expansion. So what data is being used? Today's presentation will use a variety of annual and quarterly data from 2005 to 2019 for Duke Energy. This includes revenue, gross profit, net income, total assets, total liabilities, and more. Other data will be PE ratio, return on investments, and value created. While I am just one person trying to make sense of some data, a company has multiple people working together collecting all the internal and external data related to their company to create value for each year. The graphic on the screen is from Duke Energy's sustainability report from 2018. The 2019 report is not out yet, so this one will be used. At the end of this model, they have the creating value section, which is where they use the data to establish what value it had throughout the year for various things, such as investments in communities or reliability of the company. The value of the data for this presentation cannot produce the same value as the prior graphic. Limitations of publicly available data being pulled is part of this reason. However, the data collected can be used to identify if Duke Energy is on the right track towards company goals that have been set and in progress for years, such as customer and stakeholders and the company itself. The value of the data will be determined on two things. Can it show why individuals have chosen to invest in Duke Energy over the past few years, and can it show if Duke Energy is doing their part in investing in their customers in occupied areas? The visual on the screen shows the past 5 years of the Duke Energy value creation model and the 6 major components that they look at from their data collection. From this data, patterns can be found. For investments, annual and quarterly data about the company's performance along with past stock data forms financial patterns. For customer engagement and experience, data about social media usage and investment back into the community forms patterns for Duke Energy. A good question to ask is what shapes these patterns? For investments, the performance of the company on a quarterly and annual basis drastically shapes how the patterns for the investments are formed. Regarding customer engagement and experience, how Duke Energy engages with their customers on a social media platform and the distribution of investments based on location shapes how the data patterns are formed. These variables will be looked at later in the presentation. One may ask how these patterns and trends will be found. Techniques such as clustering, association, and correlations are used frequently within the data world. With the data collected for this scenario, data clustering is not exactly appropriate. The collected data does not present viable means to use clustering techniques. If data such as smart meter usage or renewable energy generation from the various sites across the US for Duke Energy were able to be collected, clustering would be appropriate for those scenarios. While clustering may not work, association works very well with the data we have pulled. The visual on the screen showcases the quarterly return on investment and PE ratios for Duke stocks from 2010 to 2019. An individual may be curious on how the two relate to each other and are associated. In this scenario, the individual is looking at when the PE ratio is greater than 18.5, along with the return on investment being greater than 6.2%. As shown from the calculations below the graph, there is very little to moderate association between the two over time. However, if something else such as quarterly revenue and earnings per share were looked at, you can see that there is more association between the two. As shown, since 2010, there is an 83.3% chance that if the revenue is greater than $5.5 billion, that the earnings per share is greater than 70 cents. On the flip side, there is a 66.7% chance that the earnings per share is greater than 70 cents when the revenue is greater than $5.5 billion. This is mainly due to Duke Energy's quarterly revenue not jumping over $5.5 billion until late 2012. While there are more examples of data association, some of the data can be difficult to associate properly. This may be due to lack of relation between data or lack of quantity of data. Financial data was plentiful, but information for generation and electrical rates only go back a few years, and any association is inconclusive and not concrete. Moving on, let's see if one of our questions can be answered. Does Duke Energy invest more into states by distance from their headquarters or by total customer base? As shown from the visual on the right, Duke Energy invests the most money in job creation into North Carolina, South Carolina, Indiana, Florida, and Ohio and Kentucky in that order. The size of the dots on the right visual is based off the size of the customer base for that state. The result of looking at Duke Energy's economic investment into states by distance and customer base shows that they tend to invest more in occupied states based off the relative location to North Carolina's headquarters compared to the customer base total. The next set to look at is how data performs over time and if there's a correlation to it. Shown on the screen are 4 visuals using annual data for Duke Energy. You can see that over time, annual assets and liabilities both trend in the same direction and mirror each other. The same goes for annual gross profit and annual revenue of the company. When looking at annual net income and operating income, while they look different, they do follow the same trends over time and do have correlation between each other, although the net income difference between each year is more drastic than the operating income. Finally, the earnings per share since 2010 has a pattern, and one could predict that at the end of 2020, the earnings per share will be down compared to the 2019. The last correlation to look at are coincidental correlations. Visual on the screen compares Duke Energy's operating income since 2010 compared to former Charlotte Hornets superstar Kemba Walker's points per game since he was drafted into the NBA and on the Charlotte Hornets. As you can see, the two trends follow very close and have a pretty strong correlation, although they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. Now that financial data has been looked at, let's look at some social media. Diving into Duke Energy's social media reveals alignment with their presence and their goal to expand the customer experience. As shown from the visual, Duke Energy's most retweeted tweets relate to interacting with the customers and providing them updates. A more broad look at the company shows that their Twitter account is pretty high in engagement rank. There's always room for improvement, but the Twitter account actually interacts with customers pretty frequently. As shown, the analysis of social media has led to Duke Energy being able to optimize community outreach. Their top 5 favorited and retweeted tweets relate to reaching out to communities about natural disasters, company updates, and community updates. In this digital age, social media platforms are able to be used to communicate with customers on a large scale. Duke Energy should continue to optimize their social media usage, and expended resources and costs to do this would be minimal as the accounts are already operational, although additional manpower may be required to use the accounts. It is worth for Duke Energy to do this as there's very little risk involved, and it promotes community outreach and provides additional data to be collected for analysis. When looking at the financial network data that was previously discussed, the trends for these two are different. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the financial data will likely dip for the second quarter, and the third quarter may be affected as well. This will definitely skew the data when looked at. However, in the short term, this is great for network analysis trends as they are likely to increase as communication is currently being done virtually. In the long term, once the economy stabilizes, the financial numbers should return to normal and then gradually increase as they have been for the past few years. This includes revenue, income, and stocks. The last topic has to do with international expansion. Duke Energy is currently only based in the US with some international operations in Saudi Arabia. However, if the company were to expand into another country, they should target Canada. The company already has presence in Ohio and Indiana, which are relatively close to the border. The major Canadian city of Toronto is nearby the border, and then the company can work through Ottawa and Montreal. Of course, with international expansion comes concerns. The United States and Canada have a positive relationship. They are primary trade partners, have mutual trade and investment agreements, multiple embassies and consulate generals within each country, and they work closely on various global committees. A major political concern at the moment is COVID-19, with the closing of borders that would cause massive issues if Duke Energy were to plan to set up operations in Canada in the short term. For climate, the United States and Canada have a shared environment. They are both on the North American continent and are connected. That gives the countries both the same concerns, which include climate change, water quality, and air quality. In addition, Duke Energy already occupies states with a variety of weather conditions such as heat and hurricanes from Florida, cold snow, and potential blizzards from Indiana and Ohio, both of these conditions that Toronto experiences on a yearly basis. Duke Energy would be able to deal with these climate issues and operate as normal. One final concern is terrorism. There's always a threat that a terrorist act could occur in a facility, but in the digital age, cyber terrorist attacks are a primary threat. Sharing data for the company and making sure no leaks occur to damage the reputation and trust of the new customers is essential. As shown, data can be used to piece together patterns and trends. Certain techniques are more appropriate given collected data, and correlations can exist but also be misleading. Analysis of social media showcases how a company interacts with their audience and what can be improved upon. And if it were to occur, it is recommended that Duke Energy expand into Canada. Thank you for your time. This concludes the presentation.